So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Hand over the library keys, Beatrice Vance snapped, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the parlor. You don't need to be hovering over Mother's archives when you can barely manage your own life. Elena Vance didn't look up immediately. She kept her gaze fixed on the mahogany doors of the study, where Dr. Eris Thorne had vanished 10 minutes ago. The air in the manor was suffocating, thick with the cloying scent of funeral lilies and the sharp, expensive musk of Beatrice's perfume. It was a smell Elena had come to associate with every childhood disappointment, a fragrance that signaled the arrival of a storm. Did you hear me, Elena? Her sister-in-law continued, her tone sharpening. Beatrice stepped closer, the rhythmic, predatory click of her designer heels echoing against the marble floor. She looked perfectly composed, her black silk suit tailored to a needle's point, not a single hair out of place despite the tragedy unfolding upstairs. The estate needs an immediate inventory. Your sentimental loitering is only slowing down the process. Mother is still breathing, Beatrice, Elena said softly. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt the cold, jagged weight of a small brass key tucked into the palm of her hand, hidden within the folds of her skirt. Beatrice let out a short, disparaging laugh that made Patricia Vance, Clara's younger sister, flinch from her seat by the window. Julian Thorne, the family's longtime attorney, stood near the fireplace, his expression a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes darted toward Elena with a flicker of pity. Marcus Vance, Beatrice's son, hovered near the drinks trolley, his fingers trembling as he poured a glass of scotch he definitely didn't need. Breathing is a technicality at this stage, and we all know it, Beatrice sneered. She turned toward Julian, her voice rising so the entire room could hear. Julian, tell her. As the primary executor of the Vance interests, I have a responsibility to secure the historical assets. We can't have a mere book restorer, a hobbyist, really, fiddling with first editions that are worth more than her entire annual salary. The insult hung in the air, naked and ugly. Elena saw Patricia's knuckles whiten as she gripped her lace handkerchief, and Marcus looked away, unable to meet his aunt's eyes. It was a classic Beatrice move. Remind everyone of Elena's perceived lower status, labeling her professional expertise as a lowly trade in front of the people who mattered. The will hasn't been read yet, Beatrice, Julian Thorne interjected, his voice cautious. Until such time as Clara passes and the documents are unsealed, the library remains under the current household's jurisdiction. Beatrice's eyes narrowed into slits. She turned back to Elena, leaning in so close that the scent of her perfume became a physical assault. You think you're special because she let you play with her dusty old ledgers. You're a glorified librarian, Elena. Once the doctor comes down those stairs, your little residency in this house is over. I'll have your things on the curb before the obituary is even printed. Elena felt the rage spike in her chest, a hot, searing flame that she fought to keep under control. She thought of the long nights she had spent by Clara's bedside over the last month, the whispered secrets the matriarch had shared when Beatrice was out at her galas. She remembered the way Clara's frail hand had gripped hers, pressing the brass key into her palm just 3 nights ago. Don't let her see you bleed, Elena, her mother had whispered. Wait for the ink to dry. I'm not going anywhere, Elena said, her voice dropping to a level of calm that seemed to unsettle Beatrice more than a scream would have. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the key and the corner of a small, leather-bound notebook Beatrice knew nothing about. The heavy doors at the top of the stairs creaked open. Dr. Eris Thorne appeared on the landing, his face pale and drawn. He didn't need to speak. The way he slowly removed his spectacles and bowed his head told the story. A heavy, ringing silence descended on the room. Patricia let out a choked sob, and Marcus dropped his glass, the crystal shattering against the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Beatrice didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She checked her diamond-encrusted watch and turned to Julian. It's 4:15. We'll gather in the library at 5 sharp for the preliminary reading. I want this settled before the press starts sniffing around. She turned her gaze back to Elena, a triumphant smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Keys, Elena, now, don't make me call security to escort you to your room." Elena stood up slowly. She felt the eyes of the room on her, Julian's curiosity, Patricia's grief, Marcus's shame, and Beatrice's naked greed. She reached into her pocket, but she didn't pull out the brass key. Instead, she pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive Clara had kept hidden in her jewelry box. "You can have the library keys, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice echoing with a new, terrifying authority. She tossed the heavy ring of iron keys onto the coffee table where they landed with a dull thud. "But you might want to be careful what you look for in there. Mother was a very meticulous record keeper." Beatrice snatched the keys up, her eyes flashing with victory, oblivious to the warning. "Finally, a moment of sense. Julian, come. We have work to do." As they moved toward the library, Elena stayed behind in the shadows of the parlor. She watched her sister-in-laws retreating back, the woman who had spent a decade treating her like a servant in her own family home. Beatrice thought she had just won the keys to the kingdom. She had no idea she had just walked into a vault of her own crimes. Elena looked down at the thumb drive in her hand. The countdown had begun. 5 o'clock, Julian," Elena called out, her voice cold and clear. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. I think Mother has a few things to say to all of us." Beatrice paused at the library door, a flicker of doubt finally crossing her face, but her arrogance pushed it aside. She disappeared into the room, slamming the door behind her. Elena turned to the window, watching the first drops of rain begin to streak the glass. The lion was awake, and the hunt was about to begin. The next morning, the Vance estate was bathed in a deceptive, golden sunlight that did nothing to thaw the icy silence gripping the breakfast room. Elena Vance stood in the doorway for a moment, her fingers tracing the smooth, cold surface of the thumb drive hidden in her apron pocket. It was a small weight, yet it felt heavier than the centuries-old ledgers she usually restored. Across the room, the sharp clink of a silver spoon against fine bone china echoed like a gunshot. Beatrice Vance sat at the head of the table, draped in a silk morning gown that cost more than Elena's entire restoration kit. She didn't look up, her attention fixed on a luxury real estate magazine. "You're late, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with a casual, practiced disdain. "And you smell of dust and vinegar. It's offensive to the senses before noon." "I was in the workshop," Elena replied, her voice remarkably steady. She moved toward the sideboard, the scent of bitter, over-roasted espresso filling the air. "There's a lot of work to finish before the 5 o'clock meeting." Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as she took in Elena's simple work clothes. "About that, don't bother unpacking your tools today. I've already contacted a clearance crew. Your little studio in the carriage house is being gutted starting tomorrow. Marcus needs a proper space for his home gym, and frankly, your hobby has become a fire hazard to the estate's insurance profile." The audacity of the statement hit Elena like a physical blow. That studio had been her sanctuary, the place where her mother, Clara, had taught her the delicate art of preserving history. To Beatrice, it was just square footage to be reclaimed for her son's vanity. Marcus Vance entered the room then, sliding into a chair with the entitled grace of a prince. He didn't offer a greeting, merely snapping his fingers at a passing maid for juice. "Mom's right, Elena," he said, checking his reflection in the polished silver creamer. "That shed is full of rotting paper. It's depressing. Besides, no one reads those old family records anyway. They're better off in a dumpster." "Those rotting papers are the history of this family, Marcus," Elena said, her pulse quickening. She looked at Beatrice, who was now delicately peeling an orange, the citrus scent sharp and acidic. "And they contain very specific details about the trust fund allocations from the last 5 years. Details that the auditors will find quite interesting when they arrive this afternoon." Beatrice's hand paused. For a fleeting second, the mask of arrogance slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, jagged panic. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a harsh, mocking laugh. "Auditors, don't be theatrical. You don't have the authority to call an audit, and you certainly don't have the spine to follow through on a threat. You're a restorer, Elena. You fix things that are broken. You don't break things that are already whole. I'm not breaking anything, Beatrice, Elena said, her voice dropping to a cold, precise whisper. I'm simply removing the varnish. Sometimes you find rot underneath that can't be sanded away. She turned and walked out before Beatrice could respond, the sound of her own footsteps on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. She retreated to the hallway, pulling her phone from her pocket. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand didn't shake as she dialed the number she had memorized years ago. Patricia, Elena said when the call connected. It's Elena Vance. I have the files. Everything Mother recorded is on the drive. The embezzlement, the forged signatures, the offshore transfers Beatrice thought were hidden. It's all here. Are you safe, dear? Patricia Vance's voice was warm, a stark contrast to the venom in the dining room. Once this starts, there's no going back. Beatrice will fight like a cornered animal. Let her, Elena said, looking out the window at the carriage house. I've spent 10 years being the quiet one. I've spent 10 years watching her strip this family of its dignity. The 5 o'clock meeting isn't just a discussion, Patricia. It's an eviction notice. She hung up and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. She could hear the muffled sound of Beatrice shouting at Marcus in the other room, the tone frantic and sharp. The lion wasn't just awake, it had already tasted blood. Elena looked at the clock on the wall. 6 hours left. 6 hours until the world Beatrice Vance had built on a foundation of lies began to crumble, brick by expensive brick. Elena reached into her pocket and gripped the thumb drive one last time, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The hunt was no longer a plan, it was a promise. By 3 o'clock, the afternoon heat had turned the air inside the Vance estate thick and stifling, though the library remained as cold as a tomb. Elena sat behind the heavy mahogany desk that had once belonged to her father, the silence of the room broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. She watched the dust motes dance in the shafts of light, her fingers tracing the cold, metallic edge of the thumb drive. It felt heavier than it had an hour ago, a concentrated weight of 10 years of deception. The door creaked open, and Julian Thorne stepped inside, his expression as sharp as the crease in his charcoal suit. He didn't speak immediately. He simply walked to the desk and laid a leather-bound folder over the blotter. The scent of expensive cologne and old parchment followed him, a stark contrast to the cloying floral perfume Beatrice had been spraying throughout the hallways all morning. "It's all there, Elena," Julian said, his voice a low gravel. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the computer screen. "The offshore transfers, the shell companies Beatrice set up using your mother's forged signature, and the final tally of the embezzlement. She didn't just skim the surface. She gutted the family trust." Elena didn't blink. She felt a strange, icy calm settling over her bones. And the property deeds. "The carriage house, the main estate, and the vineyard in Napa," he confirmed, tapping the folder. "Legally, they were never hers to leverage, because Clara had already moved them into a secondary trust in your name 2 years before she died. Beatrice has been signing documents for properties she doesn't own." A secret power thrummed in Elena's chest. She looked at the digital files on the screen, row after row of red numbers that spelled out her sister-in-law's downfall. She thinks the 5 o'clock meeting is about her taking full control of the Vance legacy. She's invited the board and the family lawyers to witness her coronation. "She's invited her own executioners," Julian remarked dryly. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Are you ready for the fallout? Once you reveal this, the Vance name will be dragged through the mud. Beatrice will be lucky if she avoids prison, let alone social exile. The name was dragged through the mud the moment she started stealing from a dying woman," Elena replied, her voice steady. She stood up, smoothing the front of her modest navy dress. She wasn't wearing the designer labels Beatrice favored, but she felt more powerful than she ever had in her life. She tucked the drive into her pocket and headed toward the grand staircase. As she reached the foyer, the sound of Beatrice's voice cut through the air like a serrated blade. She was standing near the entrance, surrounded by 2 catering staff and Marcus, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Beatrice was draped in a silk wrap that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, her fingers dripping with diamonds that had belonged to Elena's mother. "No, the lilies go in the east wing," Beatrice snapped, gesturing wildly with a glass of amber liquid. She turned her head as Elena descended the stairs, her lip curling in a practiced sneer. "Oh, look, the help has decided to grace us with her presence. Elena, dear, do try to stay out of the way. We have actual guests arriving soon, people who matter. You look like you're dressed for a funeral." "In a way, I am," Elena said, stopping on the final step. She met Beatrice's gaze with a level stare that made the older woman pause mid-sip. Beatrice laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the marble floors. She stepped closer, the smell of gin and expensive lilies preceding her. "Don't be dramatic. It doesn't suit you. Marcus, tell your aunt to go change into something less depressing. I won't have the board members thinking we keep a governess in the attic." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between them. "Mom, maybe just leave it alone for today." "Be quiet, Marcus," Beatrice hissed, not taking her eyes off Elena. She reached out, her manicured nails flicking the collar of Elena's dress. "This fabric is pathetic. It's scratchy, cheap, and utterly beneath this house. Just like you, really. You've spent 10 years living off my husband's hard work, hiding in that library like a moth. It's time you realize that your tenure here is an act of charity, not a right." The catering staff looked down, their faces flushed with the awkwardness of the public humiliation. Elena felt the sting of the insult, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she leaned in, her voice a soft, dangerous whisper. "You're right about one thing, Beatrice. Charity has its limits, and yours just ran out." Beatrice's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine confusion crossing her face before her mask of arrogance slid back into place. "Is that a threat? From you? You don't even have the spine to ask for a raise, let alone challenge me." She turned back to the staff, dismissing Elena with a wave of her hand. "Get out of my sight. The meeting starts in 90 minutes. If you're not out of the main house by then, I'll have the locks changed while you're still in the library." Elena watched her walk away, the click of Beatrice's high heels on the marble sounding like a countdown. She reached into her pocket, her thumb brushing the drive. She could almost taste the coming justice, a cold, sharp flavor that settled on the back of her tongue. She walked back toward the library, passing the grandfather clock as it chimed the half-hour. 90 minutes. The board members were already beginning to pull into the long, winding driveway in their black sedans. Dr. Eris Thorne and the other trustees would be seated in the dining room soon, expecting a routine transfer of power. Elena stepped into the small side office and picked up the landline. She dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "It's time," she said when the voice on the other end answered. "Bring the original ledger and the forensic accountant. We're going to give Beatrice exactly what she asked for." She hung up and looked out the window. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, jagged shadows across the lawn. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and Beatrice Vance was currently toast-mastering her own destruction in the next room. Elena sat down and opened her laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. The lion wasn't just awake, it was ready to eat. The following morning, the air in the Vance estate was thick with the lingering scent of lilies and beeswax. A funeral for a legacy Beatrice was eager to bury. Elena stood in the foyer, her fingers tracing the worn, pebbled leather of her satchel. Inside lay the original ledger, a cold, heavy weight that felt more like a weapon than a book. Beatrice swept down the grand staircase, her emerald silk robe whispering against the marble like a snake in the grass. She didn't look like a woman who had buried her mother-in-law days ago. She looked like a queen preparing for a coronation. "Elena, you're still here?" she asked, her voice dripping with a feigned, sugary concern that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought you'd have packed your dusty brushes and moved into that little apartment by now. The board meeting is tomorrow, and I really can't have you cluttering up the dining room with your mourning." Elena didn't flinch. She met her sister-in-law's gaze with a terrifyingly calm smile. "I'm just making sure the family history is properly represented, Beatrice. You'd be surprised how much the board values meticulous records." Beatrice laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "Records! Darling, I've already rewritten the history. The trustees only care about the bottom line, and I am the one holding the pen." She reached out, flicking a stray thread on Elena's shoulder with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Go back to your books. Let the adults handle the future. You don't have the stomach for what comes next." Marcus Vance stood by the arched window in the breakfast nook, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He watched the exchange, his brow furrowed in a rare moment of lucidity. He had seen Elena in the library late at night, and he had seen the way her eyes changed. The submissive, grieving niece was gone. In her place was something cold, sharp, and calculated. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "maybe we should double-check the audit one last time." "If there's a discrepancy in the Foundation's filings—" "There are no discrepancies, Marcus," Beatrice snapped, not even turning to look at her son. "Only opportunities. Now, Elena, if you're going to stay for the night, try to stay out of sight. Julian Thorne is coming by later to finalize the transfer documents, and he doesn't need to be reminded of the family's more eccentric, impoverished branches." Elena leaned in closer, the scent of Beatrice's expensive, cloying perfume filling her lungs. "I'll be there tomorrow, Beatrice. I wouldn't miss it for the world, just remember. Sometimes the things we try to bury have the deepest roots, and roots have a way of cracking even the strongest foundations." Beatrice rolled her eyes, turning her back to check her reflection in a gilded mirror. "How poetic. Now get out of my sight. I have a legacy to claim." Elena walked away, the sound of her own steady footsteps on the hardwood grounding her. She felt the secret power tucked in her bag, the evidence that Patricia Vance had helped her verify. She had spent years restoring books, learning how to find the hidden text beneath the surface, how to repair what was broken. But she knew that some things, like Beatrice's soul, were beyond restoration. That evening, the house grew silent, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Elena sat in the small guest room, the glow of her laptop illuminating the forensic accountant's final report. Dr. Eris Thorne was the key. He had loved Clara, and he had spent 40 years protecting the Vance reputation. He would not take kindly to finding out it had been hollowed out from the inside. Elena looked at the clock. 22 hours. The board members would arrive expecting a routine transfer of power. They expected to see Beatrice Vance take the throne. Instead, they were going to witness a fall. Elena closed the satchel, the click of the latch sounding like a gavel in the quiet room. The warning had been given. The arrogance had been documented. Now all that remained was the dawn. The following evening, the Vance estate was transformed into a fortress of polished marble and whispered expectations. By 7 o'clock, the air in the Grand Library was thick with the cloying, suffocating scent of Casablanca lilies, Beatrice's favorite. The fragrance was so aggressive it felt like a physical weight, designed to mask the faint, lingering smell of old paper and history that usually defined this room. Beatrice Vance stood at the center of the room, a vision in emerald silk that shimmered like oil on water. She held a crystal flute of champagne, her laughter ringing out with a practiced, melodic sharpness that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was in her element, surrounded by the board members of the Vance Foundation, moving between them with the predatory grace of someone who had already tasted victory. Elena Vance watched from the shadows of the arched doorway. She had chosen a charcoal suit, sharp-edged and understated, a stark contrast to the performative opulence of her sister. In her hand, she gripped the handle of her leather satchel. The weight of the forensic report inside felt like a live wire, pulsing against her hip. She took a breath, the cool air of the hallway meeting the stifling heat of the library, and stepped forward. The clatter of Elena's heels on the parquetry floor was a deliberate intrusion. Beatrice turned, her smile tightening at the corners. She didn't miss a beat, excuse herself from Julian Thorne, and glided toward her sister. "You're late," Beatrice whispered, her voice a low hiss beneath the veneer of a socialite's greeting. She reached out, her fingers tipped with blood-red polish, pinching the fabric of Elena's sleeve. "And you're dressed for a funeral. Honestly, Elena, have some respect for the occasion. This is a celebration of the family's future, not another day in your dusty workshop. I think the attire is appropriate for what's coming, Elena replied, her voice level and chillingly calm. She didn't pull away. She simply met her sister's gaze until Beatrice was the one to blink. Beatrice let out a dismissive, airy laugh, loud enough for Dr. Eris Thorne to hear as he approached. Always so dramatic. Eris, look at her. My sister still thinks she's in a Gothic novel. Elena, why don't you make yourself useful? Go find Marcus and tell him to stop brooding by the bar. He needs to look like a future director, not a disgruntled teenager. I'm not here to run errands, Beatrice, Elena said. Beatrice's eyes flashed with a sudden, ugly heat. She leaned in closer, the smell of her expensive, spicy perfume clashing with the lilies. You are here as a courtesy, because I didn't want the board asking why the other sister was missing while I took my rightful place. Sit in the back, keep your mouth shut, and try not to look so impoverished. It's bad for the brand. She patted Elena's cheek, a sharp, condescending sting, and swept away before Elena could respond. Elena didn't flinch. She adjusted the strap of her bag and scanned the room. Julian Thorne was deep in conversation with a group of investors, his expression unreadable. Near the fireplace, Patricia Vance sat in a high-backed velvet chair, her eyes finding Elena S. across the crowded room. Patricia gave a singular, slow nod. It was the signal. The alliances were set. Marcus Vance stood near the mahogany bar, looking exactly as Beatrice had described, brooding. He caught Elena's eye and looked away quickly, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. He knew the foundations were cracking, even if he didn't know which wall was about to fall first. The atmosphere shifted as Dr. Eris Thorne stepped toward the heavy oak table at the front of the library. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing off the rows of leather-bound books that had once belonged to Clara Vance. The room fell into a sudden, expectant silence. This was the moment the city's elite had gathered for, the formal transfer of the Vance Foundation's chairmanship. Thank you all for coming, Eris began, his voice gravelly and weighted with authority. We are here to honor the legacy of Clara Vance and to ensure the stewardship of her vision passes into capable hands. Beatrice stepped up beside him, her chin tilted up, her expression one of humble triumph. She looked every bit the grieving, dedicated daughter. She looked like a woman who had spent her life sacrificing for the family name, rather than hollowing it out from the inside. Before we begin the formal vote, Beatrice said, her voice projecting with practiced ease, I want to say a few words about my mother. She was a woman of great discipline, but in her final months, her mind. It wasn't what it used to be. She became paranoid, confused. It has been the great burden of my life to protect her reputation during that decline, to manage the finances she could no longer comprehend, and to ensure that the Vance name remained untarnished by her. She paused, feigning a catch in her throat. Her unfortunate instability. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the board members. Julian Thorne narrowed his eyes. Elena felt a cold, sharp rage bloom in her chest. It wasn't enough for Beatrice to steal the money. She had to steal their mother's dignity, too. Elena moved then, walking slowly toward the front of the room. She didn't head for the chairs. She headed for the table. Beatrice's eyes widened as she saw her sister approaching. She tried to maintain her poise, but a vein began to throb in her temple. Elena, dear, we're in the middle of a session. Please take your seat. I have something to add to the record regarding Mother's instability, Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that cut through the room like a blade. She reached into her satchel. The sound of the zipper opening was like a gunshot in the quiet library. She felt the eyes of every board member on her, the witnesses Beatrice had invited to her own coronation. Beatrice stepped forward, her hand reaching out to intercept her sister, her face a mask of frantic, whispered threats. Don't you dare! I will ruin you, Elena. I will leave you with nothing. Elena didn't stop. She pulled the thick, bound folder from the bag and slammed it onto the mahogany table. The sound was deafening. She looked directly at Dr. Eris Thorne, then at the board, and finally she turned her gaze to her sister. You're right about one thing, Beatrice, Elena said, her voice dropping to a deadly, quiet silk. Some things are beyond restoration, but the truth isn't one of them. Elena reached for the first page of the report, her finger hovering over the signature that would dismantle Beatrice's life. Beatrice's face began to pale, the emerald of her dress suddenly making her look sickly, her mouth opening to scream for security just as the first document hit the light. Beatrice's voice died in her throat, the half-formed scream for security withering as the first document slid across the polished mahogany. The heavy silence of the boardroom was broken only by the low, mechanical hum of the overhead projector, which smelled faintly of warm dust and ozone. Elena Vance didn't look at the guards hovering by the door. She kept her eyes locked on her sister, whose hand remained frozen midair, clutching a designer clutch like a useless shield. "Look at the dates, Eris," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady blade that cut through the tension. She gestured toward the digital screen where a high-resolution scan of a handwritten ledger appeared. "My mother didn't just keep a diary, she kept an audit." Dr. Eris Thorne leaned forward, his spectacles slipping down the bridge of his nose as he studied the screen. Beside him, Marcus Vance went rigid, his youthful face pale as he recognized his mother's distinctive, looping signature on a series of unauthorized transfer authorizations. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of fear. Beatrice tried to laugh, but the sound was a jagged, desperate thing. "This is a fabrication." Elena has always been prone to delusions of grandeur. She's a book restorer, for heaven's sake. She lives in the past because she can't handle the present. "The present is exactly what you should be worried about," Elena replied. She tapped a key on her laptop. A bank statement from 3 years ago flickered into view, highlighted in a bruising shade of blue. This account was supposed to fund the Vance Foundation's literacy program. Instead, it paid for your villa in Tuscany. And here, she scrolled down, is the signature of the witness you claimed was present when Clara signed over her power of attorney. Only, the notary listed has been dead since 2014. The color didn't just leave Beatrice's face. It seemed to be sucked out by an invisible vacuum, leaving her skin the shade of damp, gray parchment. Her carefully applied crimson lipstick now looked like a garish bloodstain against her sudden pallor. Her throat worked in visible, frantic gulps, her pulse thrumming violently against the delicate gold chain at her neck. The arrogance that usually sat on her brow like a crown shattered, replaced by a raw, wide-eyed terror that made her look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. Her hands, usually so steady and demanding, began to tremble with a rhythmic violence, causing her heavy diamond rings to click against the wood of the table, a frantic metallic telegraph of her total undoing. Julian Thorne, the board's most senior member, let out a slow, sharp breath. "My God, Beatrice, you didn't just embezzle. You forged a dead woman's hand." "I did it for the family," Beatrice hissed, her eyes darting toward the exit, but the guards Elena had anticipated were no longer looking to her for orders. They were looking at the evidence. "I kept us relevant. Elena would have let us rot in some dusty library." Marcus stood up, his chair screeching against the marble floor. The sound was like a physical blow. "You told me Grandma was confused, Mom. You told me she didn't know where the money was going." He looked at Elena, his expression a mixture of shame and dawning horror. "You were gaslighting all of us." Elena gathered the original documents, sliding them back into the leather folder with a slow, deliberate grace. She felt the weight of the secret she had carried for months finally lifting, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She didn't need to shout. The truth was doing the screaming for her. "You once told me I didn't belong in this room, Beatrice," Elena said, standing tall as she looked down at her sister, who seemed to be shrinking into the emerald silk of her dress. "You said I was a ghost in my own home. But it turns out, the only person who doesn't belong here is the one who turned a legacy into a crime scene." Dr. Eris Thorne looked up, his face a mask of professional disgust. "We'll need the original ledgers for the forensic auditors, Elena. And Beatrice, I suggest you call your own counsel. You won't be using the firm's." Beatrice lunged for the folder, her nails raking across the mahogany, but Elena was already turning away. She didn't stay to watch the security team step forward, or to hear the frantic, sobbing explanations that were already beginning to pour from her sister's mouth. She walked toward the double doors, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm on the stone. As she reached the threshold, she paused, looking back one last time at the chaos she had unleashed. Beatrice was slumped in her chair, the light of the projector still casting the evidence of her theft across her trembling shoulders. "The restoration is complete," Elena whispered to the empty hallway, and she stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Vance name behind her. The silence that followed Elena Vance's departure was heavier than the accusations she had left behind. In the grand library of the Vance estate, the air seemed to thicken with the scent of old paper and the ozone of the cooling projector. Eris Thorne remained at the head of the mahogany table, his hands folded over the forensic reports like a judge delivering a final sentence. He didn't look at the woman trembling at the other end of the room. His focus was entirely on the cold, hard data. Beatrice Vance didn't move for a long minute. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches that whistled in the quiet room. When she finally looked up, the transformation was jarring. The skin around her eyes seemed to lose its elasticity in real time, sagging into deep, gray hollows as the weight of the ledgers finally crushed her composure. Her mouth, once sharp with practiced condescension and expensive lipstick, now hung slack, a jagged line of disbelief that quivered every time she tried to form a word. A sickly, mottled flush crept up her neck, clashing violently with the ivory silk of her designer blouse, while her pupils shrunk to pinpricks of pure, animal terror. She looked less like a socialite and more like a cornered creature, realizing the cage door had been welded shut. "It's a fabrication," she finally rasped, her voice cracking like dry glass. She looked toward the board members, her eyes searching for a single ally. "Julian, you've known me for 20 years. You know Elena was always the unstable one. She's manipulated these files. She's always been jealous of my position." Julian Thorne didn't meet her gaze. He was busy staring at a line item on the screen that detailed a $3 million transfer to an offshore shell company, money that was supposed to have funded the family's charitable foundation. He pulled his chair back, the screech of wood on marble sounding like a scream. The inches of distance he created felt like a mile. "The digital signatures are yours, Beatrice," Eris said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The timestamps correlate with the days you claim to be overseeing the archives alone." "There is no manipulation here, only math." Marcus Vance stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the moonlight. He had spent his life basking in the reflected glow of his mother's perceived brilliance, believing the lies she spun about Elena's incompetence. Now, he looked as though he were seeing a stranger. He stepped toward the table, his footsteps heavy. "The inheritance for the restoration of the West Wing," Marcus said, his voice low and trembling with a realization that tasted like bile. "You told me the bank had frozen it due to Elena's clerical errors. You let me blame her for months while you were buying that villa in Tuscany." "Marcus, darling, I did it for us," she pleaded, reaching out a hand that shook so violently her gold bracelets clattered like shackles. "I was securing our future, your future." "I stealing from Grandma's legacy." Marcus recoiled from her touch as if her skin were caustic. "By gaslighting your own sister until she nearly lost everything. You didn't do this for me. You did it because you couldn't stand not being the most powerful person in the room." Patricia Vance stepped forward from the shadows of the bookshelves, her face a mask of weary disappointment. She held a small, leather-bound diary, one of Clara's final journals that Elena had recovered from the hidden floorboard. "Clara knew," Patricia whispered, her voice carrying the weight of the dead. "She recorded every time you took advantage of her declining health to have her sign those administrative papers. She kept a second set of books, Beatrice. She knew you were a thief, but she hoped, until her final breath, that you would find your conscience." The room seemed to shrink. Two men in dark suits, who had been waiting in the foyer at Eris's request, stepped into the light. The sight of the silver badges pinned to their lapels was the final blow. Beatrice's knees buckled. She didn't fall with grace. She collapsed into her chair, her expensive silk skirt catching on the armrest and tearing with a sharp, final sound. The board members shifted as one, a collective movement of social excision. They were already checking their phones, likely drafting the press release that would distance the Vance name from her crimes before the morning sun rose. "You have 30 minutes to gather your personal effects," Eris informed her, his tone as clinical as a coroner's. "The firm's security will escort you to the gate. The locks on the estate and the corporate offices are being changed as we speak." Beatrice looked at Marcus, a silent, desperate plea for intervention, but her son simply turned his back to her, staring out at the dark lawn where Elena had disappeared. He was a Vance, but for the first time in his life, he realized that being a Vance meant nothing if the foundation was built on rot. Elena didn't come back inside to watch the final removal. She didn't need to see the handcuffs or the way Beatrice shielded her face from the very security guards she had once treated like furniture. Elena stood by the iron gates, the cool wind ruffling her hair, listening to the distant, rhythmic sound of a heavy door closing for the last time. The restoration was indeed complete, but as she looked up at the darkened windows of the manor, she knew that some stains ran too deep for even the most careful hand to scrub away. She turned her back on the house, her heels clicking a steady, solitary rhythm on the pavement as she walked toward the car waiting at the end of the drive. She had her name back. She had the truth. And for the first time in a decade, she had the silence she had earned. 6 months had passed since the heavy iron gates of the manor had clicked shut behind the last of the forensic accountants. For Elena Vance, the interval had been measured not in days, but in the slow, meticulous resurrection of things thought lost to time. She sat in the sun-drenched solarium of the new Vance Restoration Institute, the sharp, clean scent of beeswax and cedarwood replacing the stagnant air of secrets that had once choked the family estate. She ran a gloved finger over the spine of a 17th-century ledger. Her hands were steady now, devoid of the tremors that had plagued her during the months of gaslighting and quiet war. She had her name, she had the deed, and she had the peace she had bought with the truth. But as she looked at the empty chair across from her, the weight of the cost settled in her chest. The victory was absolute, yet the house was far too quiet. Across the city, in a district where the streetlights hummed with a persistent, flickering irritation, Beatrice Vance stared at a different kind of ledger. Her surroundings were a stark inversion of the life she had curated with such lethal precision. The air in the one-bedroom apartment smelled of damp plaster and the cheap, synthetic lemon of industrial cleaner. She sat at a laminate table, her designer silk robe now frayed at the cuffs, staring at a summons for a civil suit she could no longer afford to fight. Her reflection in the cracked hallway mirror was a ghost of the woman who had once commanded boardrooms. The high society friends who had sipped her vintage champagne had vanished the moment the handcuffs clicked. Now, the only sound was the rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet and the muffled shouting of neighbors through the thin, paper-gray walls. She reached for her phone, a habit born of decades of power, only to remember it had been disconnected 2 days ago. The isolation was a physical weight, a crushing reminder that her currency had always been fear, and without her fortune, she was bankrupt in every sense of the word. She had spent a lifetime treating people like furniture. Now, she was the one discarded in a corner, gathering dust. Patricia visited the institute later that afternoon, her heels clicking softly on the restored parquet floors. She found her niece standing by the window, watching the gardeners replant the rose bushes that Beatrice had let wither. "Marcus called me this morning," Patricia said, her voice a gentle anchor in the vast room. "He's working at the shipyard, entry-level logistics. He told me his back hurts every night, but he's sleeping better than he has in years." Elena turned, a small, bittersweet smile touching her lips. Marcus Vance had been the only one to reach out, not for money, but for a letter of recommendation for a job that required actual labor. He had chosen the hard path of redemption over the easy descent into bitterness. "He's a Vance," Elena murmured, looking back at the garden. "He's finally learning what that's supposed to mean. It's not about the gold on the ceiling, it's about the foundation." "And what about you, Elena?" Patricia asked, stepping closer. "The archives are settled. The embezzlement has been repaid to the estate. The name is cleared. Is it enough? Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. Inside was a grain-sized photograph of Clara Vance, taken in the years before the illness and the greed had torn the family apart. She remembered the sound of her grandmother's laughter, a sound that the manor had forgotten long before the lawyers arrived. "The justice is enough," she said, her voice firm but tinged with a lingering grief. "But the family, that's a different kind of restoration. Some things are too fragile to be glued back together, Patricia. You can fix the book, but you can't unread the tragedy inside it." She walked to the center of the room, where the matriarch's final diary lay on a velvet display cushion. It was open to the last page, where the ink was still dark and defiant. Elena had spent months treating the pages, ensuring that the evidence of the betrayal would be preserved for generations. It was a warning as much as a history. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the estate, Elena walked toward the grand staircase. She passed the portrait of her grandmother, the eyes seeming to follow her with a quiet, solemn approval. She had won the war, she had reclaimed her heritage, and she had ensured that the rot would never return. But as she reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the silent, beautiful foyer, she realized that the greatest consequence of the truth wasn't the loss of the money or the status. It was the realization that she was the last one left to tell the story. She turned off the lights, the click echoing through the hall like a final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. The restoration was finished, and for the first time in her life, she walked into the darkness without any fear of what was hiding there.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.